Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the March 2023 meeting of the Metropolitan Study Group of the SRIA. And my name is Sheen Towers. I'm currently the Director of Studies for the Metropolitan College. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce today Frater Michael Osborne. And Frater Michael is going to be giving a presentation, as you will see on the screen, entitled Allegory in Stone, the Occult and the Shakespeare Funerary Monument. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Sheen. It's very kind. Okay, so my paper today concerns the hidden symbolism in the funerary monument of William Shakespeare, which is located at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. Shakespeare died at the age of 52 on the 23rd of April, 1616. A cantilevered monument, shown here, was erected close to his grave shortly afterwards. We know it was already in place by the time the first folio of his plays were published in 1623, as the prologue by his friend Leonard Digg refers to it, and I'll read that because it's important for what follows. To the memory of the deceased author master William Shakespeare. Shakespeare, at length the pious fellows give, the world thy works by which outlive thy tomb. Thy name must be when that stone is rent. This monument cannot be overthrown, and time dissolves thy Stratford monument. When Whittleton lies low, levelled with the ground, here we all alive shall view thee still. Okay, now an interesting aside about Leonard Diggs, who wrote that, that's part of the prologue to the first folio, and Shakespeare's friend, was that his father Thomas was raised in the household of Dr. John Dee, who was essentially his stepson. And Thomas Diggs went on to become the court mathematician and astronomer for Elizabeth I. Okay. Now, the various sketches have been made of the monument down the years. Where are we? Here we are. This one is actually from, or by an engraving, I should say, by William Dugdale. It was drawn in 1634. Wenceslas Holler produced another, and he did that in 1656. And the other one that we have here is by George Virtue of 1723. Let me just bring that up. There we are. Okay. Now, all of these predate the restoration of the memorial, which took place in 1749. The last one there by Virtue, George Virtue, is considered to be the most accurate representation of the original prior to its restoration. In this particular engraving, you can see, if you contrast it with the photograph of the memorial as it appears today, that the poet's holding a quill, paper and cushion, which was absent in the very earliest sketches. But of course, at the same time, the very earliest sketches actually have a lot of inconsistencies and errors in them anyway. For example, the original one, the epitaph's not there, the cherubim are clearly out of proportion, it wouldn't work. I mean, one of them's got 3 legs, for example, and the picture of the figure of Shakespeare is too small. So William Dugdale wasn't, I don't think, trying to do anything too accurate, and the one that followed that, the one by Wenceslas Holler, was based actually on Dugdale's. So it's the Virtue one really which tells us that actually the monument hasn't changed a great deal since it was originally placed on that wall of the church. Okay. So the monument's typical of cantilevered structures at the time, cantilevered being fixed to the wall, and it's made from an array of materials as other ones are. So Shakespeare's monument was less expensive and refined than many others. There's some examples here of more finer examples, and you can see the similarities, but you can also see the contrast between Shakespeare's one and the one on the right there, which was clearly a lot more expensive. Now, the limestone figure of Shakespeare there was originally painted. It was then whitewashed in the 18th century and repainted again. And he holds a quill, a blank page, resting on a cushion. There are essentially his three working tools. There are two Corinthian columns made of polished black marble, and the inlaid panels are of black touchstone. The capitals, bases, and skull are in carved sandstone, as are the two putto or cherubim that you can see at the top there. And they symbolize Adam's labor, because the one on the left holds a trowel, and rest or in fact death perhaps, represented by the other putto, which sits atop of the skull, as you can see. And he has an inverted torch, so pointing downwards. Now, the architraves, the frieze and cornice were the only parts of the structure which were replaced in 1749. Originally, they were red-veined alabaster, but I guess that wore away, and they replaced it with more expensive white marble, as you can see here. We also don't know who erected the monument. It's likely to have been Leonard Digges and other friends of Shakespeare's, we know from the folio, but it may have been his family. It was put on the wall when his wife was still alive. I mean, she died in 1623. That's Anne Hathaway. And certainly his daughters, his surviving daughters, twins, Judith and Susanna, were still alive. And Susanna was still in Stratford. It may also have been erected by Lady Anne Clifford, one of Shakespeare's sponsors, although one would imagine that actually she might have paid for a slightly better quality monument to have been erected. I don't suppose those things were any cheaper then as they are today. Okay, so in terms of the structure then of the actual monument, so you've got some background into these things. This is the entablature. This was the part that was replaced in 1749, but it's believed to be the only part that was. And you can see why. It's better quality, harder wearing material, being white marble. And that's comprised of the cornice, the frieze, and an architrave. They're the architectural or design terms for these things. There are then the capitals. There's the shaft, the base, and we have the pedestal. Now, below this, there are what are called cornices or corbels. Now, what's unusual about that is that a lot of these memorials don't have them at all, because there's iron hooks behind it which fix it to the wall. And secondly, there are 3 of them, and there don't really need to be that many. So they add sort of symmetry and design of this rather pleasing memorial to look at. There don't need to be 3, and we'll come on to that a little later. Okay. There we have the inlaid text there, the epitaph, and inlaid panels. They're made from black touchstone. I think I may have mentioned that already. Let's find my mouse. We have the figure of Shakespeare. A lot of people note it's sort of expressionless pose, but of course the problem is that the original was actually whitewashed over and then repainted, so he may have had more expression, but it's certainly unusual actually to have an expressionless figure. Most of these Elizabethan Jacobean monuments have some sort of expression, so he may well have done. It was probably painted on, and then molded above the arch. You can't see them here. We'll look at them a little later. If you can see my mouse, you can see the arch here. There are 7 red roses above the poet's head, 7 red and gold above the poet's head. And then you have the putti or cherubs here, the poet's coat of arms, and death crowning the very summit of the whole structure or entablature. And that has a triadic form, as you can see, with the 2 putto either there and a skull above. And we have the coat of arms in the middle. And that's the basic structure of the monument. And you can see how interesting it is geometrically already. Now, the floor plan of the church, this is Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. is very odd. The older part of the church, the nave and the aisles, are actually aligned correctly east to west. But then you have the transepts and the chancel veering off to the northeast, and there may be good reason for that in terms of the ground underneath. But it is an unusual direction for a parish church to be pointed in the northeast direction. It's just a fact. There's nothing more to be drawn from that necessarily, other than it is actually in that direction. So here we are, east to west, north to south, as it should be. You'd expect the high altar to be here, and that's a northeast direction. And there is the very point where the monument is actually fixed on the north wall in the chancel. Now, it could be coincidental. There could be more to it than meets the eye. But regardless of which, it just is a fact. That's where it is. Now, a fellow called Dean Bramhall, who's buried close to Shakespeare in the late 15th century, so he was around 100 years before Shakespeare, developed or purchased a chantry for the propagation of prayers for the deceased, which was quite a common Catholic practice at that time. And you can see just above the north wall there is the location that used to be the charnel house. Now, the construction of the chancel itself took place in the late 15th century. As I say, it deliberately follows this northeast alignment. The chantry was established at the same time and was probably quartered in one of the rooms in the charnel house. The charnel house actually had 3 floors, including the basement. Now, as I say, Dean Bramhall's tomb is next to him, and then we have Shakespeare's memorial. So, if we move on to the next slide, there's the charnel house, by the way. It was demolished in 1800. In Shakespeare's time, the top room above the window would have been used by the priest as an office. Okay. It's unfortunate it's been removed. Charnel houses, of course, were where the bones of the dead were collected up when their grave space was reused, and they were put in storage, essentially, and prayers would be said for them by the priest in charge of the chantry. Now, this is the close-up of the chancel. We've got the midpoint of it there, beginning with the arrows pointing in the northeast and in other directions. Okay. Here we have the high altar, Dean Bramhall's tomb, and we have the site of the former charnel house. And just to give you the geography, that's the Shakespeare memorial, directly through the northeast point there. This is the poet's grave, that's Shakespeare's grave, where it appears in the chancel. Anne Hathaway, his wife, buried next to him. So she's between him and the memorial. His granddaughter's husband, Thomas Nash, her first husband, is buried here. And then we have Dr. John Hall, his son-in-law, and Susanna Shakespeare, his daughter. So they're the alignment of the various graves that we have. An interesting point, of course, is that northeast direction is going straight into the northeast corner of the chantry there, held in the charnel house. Now, moving to the next slide, Shakespeare is likely to have had these words inscribed on his tomb. He may not have done, of course. He could have been members of his family or friends, but it's likely to have been here. And it says, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Now, it's unlikely that Shakespeare thought that his body would ever be removed and his bones bunged into the charnel house, of course, because he was actually buried in the chancel. He was a lay rector of the church, a local landowner, and would expect to have been left in peace. So in a sense, that curse, if you like, isn't placed on his grave because he's worried that the parishioners are going to remove him. I think there's a real worry that perhaps souvenir hunters might come looking. There can't be any other real explanation for it, being where it is. Here's the chancel, a photo of the chancel, just to put things in perspective for you. You can see the memorial, Dean Bramhall's tomb next to it, and the porch or doorway leading to the old charnel house where the chantry was held behind that. So those windows there would have been blocks off originally, and there are the graves in front. So here we have the grave, here we have the memorial, here we have the door to the old charnel house, and that's the approximate area or sides where the charnel house and the old chantry altar would have been beyond that wall. Now, in 2014, an archaeological investigation was actually undertaken. The graves weren't disturbed. They used ground penetrating radar, and they found that there was a lot of disturbance in Shakespeare's grave. And it was likely actually that the head end down here was actually, his head was probably removed at some point, which fits in with a local story and a local legend that some blighters broke into the chancel, dug out his skull, which was only buried about 3 feet deep. It wasn't a deep grave, and the archaeological report substantiates that. It wasn't very deep, and he wasn't buried with any metal. We didn't find any metal about him. They removed the skull. And legend has it that they couldn't flog it on. Nobody wanted it because of the curse, and out of respect for Shakespeare, and they tried to return it, couldn't, and it ended up being placed by them in the crypt at Beeley Church instead. So that's the legend. The archaeologists actually went to see the skull in Beeley Church and found it was the skull of a woman aged around about 70. Now, there's another theory, of course, that perhaps Anne Hathaway actually had her husband's bones moved to one side, or perhaps Shakespeare was secretly buried under her grave, and that the skull could in fact be hers. So that's an interesting thought or theory to have. Certainly the grave robbers are alleged to have said that the skull they pulled out was very dainty and small, like a woman's skull. So it lends some certain credence to this. And here we have the ground penetrating radar results, Shakespeare's grave there in green and red, and the red bit is the void really, and they found that there was actually a brick structure there supporting the actual tombstone. So it's likely that his body has been disturbed at some point. Okay, moving on. The carved skull at the top there, you can see, crowning the whole entablature, is typical of Jacobean and Elizabethan memorials of the period. The contrast between life and death is often made, and images of this type are quite common for the period. I found this rather striking one. There we are, which I think is pretty good. Obviously, the carving on that particular memorial is exceptional and quite expensive. But the Elizabethans would frequently do this. It's not unusual. However, in Shakespeare's memorial, the skull is actually in direct contrast with the image of the poet's living face or worldly face. So you have a correspondence there between life and death. And it also sits somewhat interestingly with the cherubim there. If you remember, one's holding a trowel for labour, the other an inverted candle or torch for rest or death, also sitting on top of a skull, as you can see. And there's this perfect alignment with the cross. Now, the point about that, of course, is that the cross, in fact, actually is a profound symbol of the termination or end of Adam's curse and the promise of eternal life beyond the grave. So that's likely to have been intended geometrical inference going on there. And the Elizabethans, I must emphasize, were very keen on this sort of symbolism, actually. The putti, as they're called, the cherubs, here they are in greater detail. They form the base essentially of a triadic shape, which I mentioned earlier. There we have it. The skull crowns it, so you have there this sort of impression then of transition, really, labor and death, peace, I should say, and then death, of course, and in the midst of which is the coat of arms of Shakespeare. So you have very much this form going on. The entire image is essentially that this particular part of the memorial is essentially an image of judgment, mercy, and balance. Okay. Now, Shakespeare's coat of arms. What you see actually on the monument is the only contemporary image of the coat of arms. Now, what we don't know, of course, is how it was originally coloured, because it was whitewashed at some point in the 18th century. But what we do know that it was black and gold because of the grant that was given to Shakespeare after his petition for a coat of arms. And that says, and I'll quote, "Gold on a bend sable, a spear of the first, steeled argent, for the crest a falcon, his wings displayed argent, standing on a reef of his colours, supporting a spear gold, steeled, as aforesaid, set upon a helmet with mantles and tassels." So we know the colours from the description of it, and whoever restored the monument painted it correctly. Now, the heraldic motto that he had was "Non sans droit," which translates as "not without right." Aside from the obvious point that the spear references the family name, let's give you a close-up of this coat of arms. So this is a recreation of it based on the memorial and the description that I've just read. So aside from the obvious point that it's a reference to his family name and his strong feelings that he should have a coat of arms, the spear actually conveys a double meaning in this image. The first is, aside from his name, of course, the first is the Catholic mystery of the Sacred Heart, which is symbolized by the spear of Longinus, or spear of destiny. Now, this was the spear which pierced Christ's heart to draw water and blood from the wound it created, which itself is a metaphor of the dual nature of Christ in the Gospel of John. The second import of that spear, as appears in his coat of arms, is that a sharp-pointed trowel, or indeed originally a spear, was actually used outside Masonic guilds, outside the lodges of Masonic guilds, to guard against intrusion to the entrances. So long before there was a sword outside these things, there was often a long pointed trowel and sometimes a spear. Now, the colours themselves are very telling. The colours of black, gold and silver are also alchemical. The gold recalls the golden ones of Plato's Republic, who were the philosopher class ideally suited to govern a just and harmonious society, one based on the rule of reason and education. The colour gold also reminds us of the assaying of impurities in the fires of the metallurgists to extract metal. Black is that of the earth from which gold is drawn, and the silver in the tip represents Mercury, which has the power to extract gold from rough ore. So the motifs and colours in this coat of arms cannot be anything other than a statement of Shakespeare's Rosicrucian ideals. There are simply too many coincidences to draw from it. And that's before we even get sort of stuck into the meaning of the text contained in the epitaph. So here it is, black touchstone on the epitaph, as you can see it. We don't know exactly when those inscriptions appeared after his death, but they were certainly there, as you know, from the time that George Virtue did his etching of it. And indeed, Wenceslas Holler's etching in the 1650s shows them as well, actually, at least in part. Now, the Latin epitaph that you can read here, okay, it translates as follows into English. It says, "A pillion in judgment, a Socrates in genius, a Maro in art. The earth buries, the people mourn, Olympus has." Now, there are 12 words. There are 6 words in each line. There are 6 words beginning with taller letters that you can see. There are 33 letters in each line, other letters in each line, and 6 words beginning with smaller letters. There are 72 letters in total. And we can see there's a clear pattern there, quite aside from the rather cryptic poem itself. And there is then the English poem, which reads as follows. "Stay, passenger, why goest thou by so fast? Read if thou canst, whom envious death hath placed within this monument, Shakespeare, with whom quick nature died, whose name doth deck this tomb far more than cost. See, all that he hath writ leaves living art, but page to serve his wit." Now, this poem is interpreted by reference to the Latin text before it, as I'll demonstrate. The meaning is cleverly concealed, but scholars, literary experts regard the poem as mundane or obscure at best, but there's far more to it than that, as you'd expect. Now, below it, you can see here, there's a third inscription, small one there, which states that Shakespeare died at the age of 53 on the 23rd of April, 1616. He didn't, of course, he died at the age of 52. So there's a deliberate attempt to insert that particular number. Well, I don't know if there's anything in it, but if you add them up, they arrive at the number 27, which divided by 3 becomes 9 and is 3 by reduction. So there is a triadic message going on in this whole epitaph. Okay, they are Judicio Pillium, Genius Socratum, and Arte Moronum, the 3 pillars. Now let's go into that in a little more detail. Okay, so what could it possibly mean? I know when I first saw this memorial many years ago, I had no clue as to what it actually referred to or was meaning. But these things come to you, don't they? Okay, so here we are. We have the first reference then, Judicio or Judicio Pillium, refers to Nestor, the king of Pylos. Nestor is a character in the Iliad, noted for his wisdom and ingenuity. He's called the old war horse by Agamemnon. Nestor provides more ships for the war than anyone else, and he brokers the peace deal with Achilles, which ultimately leads to Greek victory in the Trojan War. And Nestor also invents a unique signalling system for Greek ships, which enabled them to fight off the Trojans at their greatest hour of need. Nestor was a good horseman and was very pious as well. He was a man of the world who understood the wisdom of the world and the way it works. And although he was the grandson of Poseidon, he was nonetheless a mortal. So he died. We then have the genius of Socrates. There's Socrates. Let's just get rid of that fair for a moment. Jumping ahead a little bit. Okay, so Socrates referenced here as Genius Socratum. Socrates was famous for the formulation of a style of debating that used cross-examination and scrutiny. It was a method of discourse intended to avoid rashness and illogical conclusions or hasty judgments. His questioning method developed the ability to consider multiple perspectives. Socrates also had a political agenda, and in promoting meritocracy, questioned the Athenian constitution itself. He argued for government by a philosophical class, schooled in the art of his method of reasoning. And as you know, of course, the Athenian state executed him And it was something that Socrates could have run away from, but he decided to stay, to give encouragement to his pupils, and also had a principle that he wasn't going to be chased away, and he was going to die for a good cause. And that, of course, was to establish a different style of government, different society, one based on meritocracy. And then we have the third one here, arte maronum. Now, that's a reference to Virgil, Maro being Virgil's surname. Now, Virgil wrote the Aeneid, which is very much regarded as the sequel to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So the three classics are often regarded as something of a trilogy. In the Aeneid, the Trojan prince Aeneas enters the afterlife as a living man to discourse with his thwarted lover, Queen Dido of Carthage. Like Odysseus and Hercules, he was one of the few mortals to enter Hades and return to the world of the living. This was a plot device later used by Dante to resurrect Virgil, essentially, to guide Dante through the three realms of hell, purgatory, and heaven. Okay. Aeneas goes on to establish Rome as well as the new Troy. The art of Virgil, therefore, most probably alludes to not the poet of Virgil, but perhaps the leadership skills of his literary creation, Aeneas. Virgil, in any event, was regarded as semi-divine by the Romans and attained immortality on account of his being the son of Venus, and he was adopted by Jupiter, and the Romans knew him by his divine name of Jupiter Indiges. Now, beneath these three luminaries, if we call them that, the Latin text refers to states of being. So this is the line underneath. Terra teget, the earth buries. Populus maret, the people mourn. This is the state of the people, the condition they're in. And Olympus habet, or Olympus has or possesses. So we thus have the plight of humanity, creation, and also our ideal system, or perhaps it's a reference to eternal life, as Virgil had. So regardless, we have these three, earth, blood, and spirit, states underneath these three luminaries. They're the black, red, and white, which sort of correspond with the golden ones above. The first four terms of alchemy, I suppose, and the primary terms embracing the alchemical opus, describing the tripartite structure of the stages of the work. So that's the condition of the materials being worked upon, earth, the altered state, of course, of the people as they improve, going all the way through to their perfection, there at the artifacts. So it's quite interesting, and again, just a reminder, Pelion in judgment, Socrates in genius, and Maro in art. The earth buries, the people mourn, but Olympus has or possesses. Sticking with the Latin inscription, this repeated threefold symbology is found in other correspondences, including even in this actually. So by way of example, actually, rather than just reading the sentences from left to right as two lines, as most people do, they can also be read up and down, and they form three distinct columns. The first there essentially translates, if you read it as a sentence, as the earth buries a Pelion in judgment. So of course it's linking Nestor there with earth. So it's the theme really essentially of the wise man entombed as a reflection of his mortality and the curse of Adam in the form of death. The parting of the physical aspect of man from his mind or soul. The inference here may also be to the legendary burial chamber of Christian Rosenkreuz. You say that's a stretch too far, but it's not, because the words above the tomb are reported to be as follows. Vista in Toria, terrae rectificando in vienes occultum lapidum, which translates as visit the interior parts of the earth. By rectification thou shalt find the hidden stone. Okay, food for thought. The second column here reads as an entire sentence. The people mourn a Socrates ingenious. So Socrates' death is marked by the failure of the Greek state to essentially coexist with genius and free thought and the Socratic method of debate, which is to listen to other points of view and to come to the right answer after reflection. Now, Plato's Republic, Plato being the disciple of Socrates, who was trained by him, Plato's Republic debates what justice is and explores the injustice of the rigid Greek view of citizenship, which existed at the time. Essentially, you're born in it, and it's impossible to change. So the idea really was to create a society of toleration of free thought, creativity and progress. So the philosopher class that would govern such a society would be chosen on merit. And this ruling elite were referred to as the golden ones, this philosopher class. The idea was, of course, that science and education would eliminate poverty and eventually also violence. This was to be the product of a 50-year program, creating an elite group of philosopher kings who would reorganize the world. And then we have the final one here. Olympus possesses or has a marrow in art. So Olympus is a metaphor for Plato's Republic. I don't think there can be any doubt of that. It's utopia. The attributes of genius work through wisdom to create the result, which is Olympus here essentially on Earth. And here we have the breakdown essentially of those three corresponding pillars or columns contained in that Latin, with the exception of one place actually. Commas also indicate where the columns are to go. Now, all of these essentially, of course, amount to wisdom, truth, and beauty. The wisdom of Nestor, that cannot be denied, it's referred to. The genius or truth that Socrates taught, and the beauty and the art of Virgil there. So they're archetypes essentially for wisdom, truth, and beauty, the three columns on which utopian society is to be established. And these are just facts from the memorial. Okay, so looking again at the Latin. Now, if you remember, I did mention that they're all capitalized, but certain words have initial letters that are higher than others, and the Elizabethans were trained to pick these things out, and they would form an anagram from. Now, the passerby in the English poem is actually challenged, that's the passenger, stay passenger, reflect a while, is actually challenged to loiter and to look at this and actually decipher the subtle symbolism contained in the monument. It's something that it's designed to do. And most esoterically minded Elizabethans and Jacobeans would have been aware of that as well. They would always look for symbols and signs and sigils and so on and so forth in architecture and images. So here are the higher letters. There are 6 of them. Okay. Now, yes, Eudicia should begin with a J. It doesn't. It's been deliberately carved with an I, and the reason for that is, of course, it forms the anagram for postin, which actually is an inflection of the word postis, which means a doorpost, portal, or entrance. Okay. Now, bearing in mind that the monument is situated here, and it's understood and generally accepted that actually the archway there implies an entrance. It's actually next door to the literal entrance to where the chantry used to be in Shakespeare's day. Okay. If we take the actual words themselves that are highlighted with these initial letters, they also form a sentence which makes sense. That's the crazy thing about it. It does make sense. And it reads that wisdom, truth, and beauty on Olympian earth, which has to be a reference to utopia. It's a reference back to Nestor, Socrates, and Virgil as archetypes involved in the governance of that utopia. Now then, we're left, of course, with the lower words. Like I say, they're all capitalized, but they're lower. And these 6 spare words also form a meaning. They're intelligible as a sentence, which could be interpreted as clever art, perhaps even guile, art in the sense of guile, artfulness, conceals the loss of what the people have or possess. So my view is that actually what you've got hidden here in this Latin epitaph, or at least an interpretation of what you're supposed to have to draw from it, is that there's a binary contrast, really, or correspondence between the ideals of utopia and the world as it's actually organized and is today, how it actually is. So the people have their inheritance, but it's being concealed and hidden from them by the existing ruling class. Okay, now this all begins to make sense of the motto that Shakespeare actually had on his coat of arms. Most people think it's simply a rather sort of egoistic reference to the fact that he was entitled to a coat of arms. That isn't the case. It's the right of the people, of course, to their improved status in a utopian form of government. So these aren't inscriptions or codes for Bacon or anyone else, and they don't particularly concern Shakespeare personally, but they are codes for the golden rule of Plato's Republic. The idea being, of course, that in contrast to views that, or anti-Stratfordian views that Shakespeare must have been written by Francis Bacon or Edward de Vere or Christopher Marlowe, how can a glove maker's son possibly do this? Well, actually, of course, the whole point of the utopian government is that genius and education and knowledge is actually to be celebrated and promoted and encouraged. And here's a result of that. So yes, the body of evidence also exists that Shakespeare and no one else was also the author of his works, the master of an ingenious imagination. This includes printed copies of his plays, the sonnets have his names on them, theatre company records exist, and there's comments by friends and contemporaries about him as well, no less than Ben Jonson rather, and John Webster. However, there's also this is in Shakespeare's handwriting, and it's actually his design for his coat of arms. Okay, so the evidence all points to this. Now then, looking at the English epitaph in this structure. Okay, it's neither mundane nor particularly obscure if you use the Latin codes that I've just gone through to make sense of this actually. So what we do is essentially, aside from the beginning bit, which is challenging, it's thrown down the gauntlet, to actually stop and try and understand this monument. We have a reference to our 3 luminaries, Nestor, Socrates, and Virgil, whom envious death hath placed within this monument. Okay, so it corresponds obviously with Shakespeare himself, but also with the mortal Nestor, who was an archetype of wisdom. You then have far more than cost, see all that he hath writ. Now, an interesting thing about Socrates actually is that he never ever wrote down his discourses. He never wrote anything down. Plato had to memorize all of it. And it also makes sense of the reference to the blank page. It's saying, this is Socrates. This is what we're pointing to. He never wrote anything down, but he was supremely wise. And it's a reference also to the fact, of course, that poor Socrates was judicially killed as well, which makes sense of the far more than cost reference. So again, it's pointing back and reinforcing what we've been told in the Latin inscription. And living art but page must refer to the works of Virgil, of course, and also corresponds quite neatly with Shakespeare's work being performed as living art as well. So it's the ability to write in a commanding and philosophical way. So we have Nestor's worldly wisdom, Socratic method of discourse, and Virgil's ability to compose, none of which are mutually exclusive, and they actually lead to the three main pillars of utopian government: wisdom, truth, and beauty, of course. Now then, you'll probably also noticed, if not, you have now, that there are these carefully aligned T's in that inscription at the bottom. It's not a coincidence that the word writ has two T's, neither is it a coincidence that they align perfectly to form a square in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, it's suggested by some that actually it refers to the 33rd degree in Freemasonry, but I think with a far more likely explanation is it refers to the Greek letter tau, which has a geometrical value of 300. So that's the value that the Greeks gave the letter tau. So if you apply a mathematical reduction, obviously you have 1200, and which eventually reduces down to 3. So again, it's telling you that this letter 3 is actually relevant. Now, the Greek architects also used the tau letter as a symbol for measurement. It represents a complete one turn, so they used it as a symbol for a 360 degree turn. Why are there 4 of them? Well, you could say 360 times 4 becomes 1440, which by reduction eventually reduces down to 9 or 3. So again, another pointer to that. It's another clever code essentially telling us that the quaternary nature of divinity is concealed within the 3 luminaries of wisdom, truth, and beauty. And there's also the possibility that the 4th element of air is being referred to there as well, as an accompaniment to the elements of earth, fire, and water that we actually discerned in that Latin script a little earlier when I went through that. So there we are. That's the gematria for the quadruple tau that appears in that inscription. Okay. So Shakespeare and Freemasonry. Well, you know, people tell us that Freemasonry didn't exist before 1717, but the fact of the matter is, of course, that no esoteric movement begins in a vacuum. They don't just suddenly appear overnight. They always had provenance. Freemasonry began long before 1717. We know this from the activities of Elias Ashmole, for example. The same can be said of the Rosicrucians, who became public in the early 17th century, but almost certainly had a provenance prior to that. So in terms of Freemasonry, in the records of the London Masons Guild, the Operative Guild, are records containing references to an affiliate guild of non-operative Masons who operated on the South Bank called the Acception. Now, Ashmole was initiated into this secretive guild in 1646. So that's, you know, like 30 years after Shakespeare died, and it's likely to have developed much earlier than this as well. So perhaps as a consequence of the Reformation and disbandment of the overtly Catholic and spiritual orders that were in Masonic guilds, this more non-operative or speculative version emerged that men of education wanted to join because they wanted to learn more about architecture and geometry and mathematics, and to make sense really of the sort of society they wanted to build in utopia. It makes perfect sense in that way. So there is a potential link between Shakespeare and Freemasonry at this stage. Now then, the parallels, I think personally, just looking at the monument before even go into detail on it, there are echoes of the first degree tracing board about it anyway, regardless. But if we think about the corbels at the bottom there, these three pins that are holding up the whole structure, there needn't be three, as I mentioned earlier. There needn't be any at all, actually. There often aren't, but there are definitely three, and they remind me very much of the pedestals, actually, on the first degree tracing board. Indisputably, however, there are two columns, but they're typical in monuments of this era, as we saw in an earlier church, but nonetheless, they're there. Working tools are definitely present. His working tools, of course, the pen, the page, and the cushion. Now, yes, you would need a cushion. You need a cushion in that day and age for lots of reasons. You're wandering around and writing, to lean on, to sit on. But it's an essential part of his sort of like working kit, really. And then there's Jacob's ladder. Well, if we think about that transition that's described and contained in the epitaph, there's an argument that actually it does point to a ladder of sorts, and in fact the whole structure draws you upwards towards that skull at the very top anyway. The 7 luminaries, okay, as they appear on the first degree tracing board, but we do also have those 7 red roses carved above the arch above Shakespeare's head, and that is more unusual. Red roses are not uncommon in Elizabethan Jacobean monuments, but 7 specifically over his figure is unusual, and that has to contain a message. Okay. And then we have the other others up there. We have the moon, the sun, and heaven, of course. And as I pointed out at the very beginning, these sort of do fit in really with the images, or symbolism, I should say, of darkness and labour, and the skull as a portal or entranceway actually to the heaven beyond life. Here, just a little slide. I just wanted to show you as best as I could the 7 roses. Some of them are obscure, but they look the same. They go all the way around in that arch above Shakespeare there. Now, with regard to these, there could in fact be a Rosicrucian explanation for them. Do they allude, for instance, to the 7-fold nature of man, or the 7 life processes? So you have the physical body, you have the etheric body, the astral body, and the ego, and then the 3 subtle souls, the lower, middle, and higher. Now, it was Plato that actually discerned 3 parts in the human soul, and the first was used to make distinctions between the thinking soul, the second located in the head, so and then you have the emotional soul in the chest. So you have that again, that 3-fold thing that it's pointing to in this image. Okay, I'm not going to discuss the Kabbalah very much at all. It's way too big a subject, essentially, really, to cover in this talk, which we're coming to the end of anyway. Separate subject, but there are potential Kabbalistic inferences in the structure. And that shouldn't surprise us if we accept that perhaps Shakespeare was a member of an early form of Freemasonry, such as Elias Ashmole was. It's the sort of thing that was quite popular at the time amongst that set of people. So we shouldn't rule out Kabbalistic influences in the monument or on Shakespeare at all. London was, at the end of the day, a melting pot of different thoughts and schools, and indeed his memorial was actually made by a company of Dutch monumental masons that settled on the south bank of the river. We know the name, we know the place where it was made. Okay, so people are coming into London, and these Flemish engravers and others, many others, would have brought ideas with them and knowledge that they had on the continent. So it's not to be thought of as a sort of like a cut and dried. There was no Kabbalah necessarily in England at that time, because I'm sure it would have been in existence in London somewhere or other. I can't do any more to give a brief overview. So we have here the monument, and if we overlay the tree of life over the monument, we actually can see clear parallels there with the monument and the structure. It could be entirely coincidental, but you have to look at that and say it isn't, because I think the whole form and structure of that alludes to and points to that. So sacred geometry, I'm not going to go into that in great length. I'll discuss it in the book, but essentially you can draw geometric principles and symbols out of the figure in the monument, and I came to this was by way of mathematical measurement within it and similar ones there, but I'm just essentially just putting those slides in there just as an illustration. Actually, there's far more to this monument than we've discussed up to this point. Okay, that's my talk. I hope you found it enjoyable. It's about enjoying these things, isn't it, at the end of the day, and open to questions or discussion. Thank you, Shane.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael, for a thoroughly fascinating and really well-researched presentation there. I'd like to hand over, please, to Kristen first. You have your hand up. It's lovely to see you, Kristen.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question. A couple of things come to mind. I hope they're not silly to ask, but the first thing is I'm wondering what he may think of the theory that the true identity of Shakespeare was really a very high initiate who allowed an actor in the troupe named Will Shakespeare to take credit for his books while he remained in the background. And if this is so, did the real Shakespeare die at 52 or the actor?
Well, I mean, a lot of people have different theories on it, don't they? Bacon, De Vere, and Marlowe, and amongst others. I don't know. I mean, it could be, couldn't it? But personally, I think it's the man from Stratford. That's just a hunch I have, and sometimes you have to rely on just a hunch, don't you? And there's a few reasons for it, really. One, I think that a lot of those sort of anti-Stratfordian arguments are based on a sort of inverted snobbery, in the sense that how could someone from an English Midlands town like Stratford in the boondocks of England, a glover's son, ever have written such things? How could he possibly have done it? It must have been someone that went to university, surely. But no, I mean, geniuses are born. I mean, Mozart was one, isn't he? They come about. And I do think it's him. And as I mentioned in my talk, there is enough documentary evidence and theatre records and reference to his name on manuscripts and the like. And it was him that designed his coat of arms, for instance. So I just have a view on that, but I would never, it's not anything that I would get too weighed down on, because at the end of the day, if he is an allegory or what's the word I'm thinking of, a sort of stooge, I suppose, actually, rather, for somebody like Bacon, then Bacon doesn't want to be identified anyway. That was the whole point of doing it. It's about the work. It's about the message it conveys. So let's not focus on authorship. Let's focus on the message.
Okay, thank you.
You like that? Is that?
Yeah,
and
it's interesting.
What's your view?
Well, I'm still not convinced, because for one thing, I mean, this may be off on a tangent, but I think of someone like the character who went by the name Saint Germain. He's documented. I've read all his biographies to have lived hundreds of years. And in the late 1700s, he made the comment, I'm tired. I must go to the Himalayas and rest, but in 85 years, I'll be back in the public. So, so then I wonder, with all these questions, if that is true, that Shakespeare really, the real individual, was a high initiate, sort of behind the scenes. I just wonder.
Well, I'll tell you what, he's certainly mixed with them if it is him. By way of example,
certainly what?
Shakespeare would have mixed with high initiates, you see. That was without any doubt. I mean, if you think even of Leonard Digges, I mean, his father was raised in John Dee's household. I mean, these are the people that Shakespeare met and knew.
Right.
So yeah, I think he definitely mixed with them. I suppose if he was a pupil, perhaps, of somebody that was a higher adept, then that would have influenced his work as well. Mm. And besides, you get influenced by people all the time, don't you? When you listen to them and talk to them, they might give you ideas. They may give you quotes. I don't know. There's a lot of collaboration as well. Don't forget though, in anything that's artistic, and theatre, films, and like nowadays, if you think about it, they have hundreds of people, don't they, on a movie that make a movie. Just look at the credits, So I guess there was probably less people involved in his work back then, but there would have been others. He wouldn't have done it entirely on his own.
True. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. I'd like to hand over to Medicus, please.
Thank you very much for a fantastic lecture, Michael. Multiple times I've seen you present in, and it's been wonderful. We've got two questions. I see that you alluded to the hidden geometry of some of the aspects of the monument. Would this give credence then to perhaps maybe Shakespeare's sonnets title page and the amount of hidden symbology that's behind that?
Well, they'd use any and every opportunity to do it, wouldn't they? So yes, but I didn't want to sort of dwell on that actually, for obvious reasons, because you can get sort of like dragged down a particular path, can't you?
Indeed, that's why I bring it up. It's interesting because it's something you kind of want to dismiss, and then this kind of, if this is his tell, then it does sort of allude to that.
Yeah, I'd say it does. Yeah, I mean, particularly the anti-Stratfordians tend to have this sort of way of picking apart, don't they, as well, the text itself, to look for clues for Francis Bacon and things like that. And there may be something in it, I just don't know. But the other danger, sorry, pop-ups constantly come in. The other danger is that sometimes you can look for things that aren't there, can't you? You can see too much in it. But you've got to remember, this particular generation, the Elizabethans and Jacobeans, were well into this stuff. They loved it. And for them, it was a bit of a game as well to pick out things and to see how much they knew or how clever they were. So it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest that the sonnets would contain similar sort of material. Yeah.
The second part is that I notice, especially looking at the cherubim either side, one of the pictures showed both of their faces towards the center, as one of the pictures had one of the faces pointing away. And if we look at the three crucifixions with the two thieves surrounding Jesus, we've obviously got certain entities representing one side looking towards Jesus and the other side looking away. So I was wondering which of those was legitimate and which one you believe it was, and whether or not that has any reference to.
Are you referring to the earlier engravings and sketches that were made?
I believe somewhere between sort of halfway through the presentation there was a side by side, and one of them, both the angels' faces were looking inwards,
right, okay.
Whereas on the other one it was one in, one out.
Okay. So that particular image, because I was searching around for a close-up of the cherubs to put in this talk, I couldn't find one. So somebody somewhere has actually done a replica, and that larger one that you saw was a replica. So it's the one that you see fixed on the wall that is the authentic position. So I thought for a moment you might have been referring to like the Dugdale sketch and the one that came after that by Holler, because the cherubs are different there as well, although they're still facing away. So
Okay.
the original thing will be facing away.
Okay. So with the one on the wall, both the cherubims are looking towards. The original sketches, they're looking away.
Well, I mean, that's the question. Are the sketches of that, are they? Yeah, that's an interesting point. Who knows? I mean, either the monument's unchanged and they're looking in, or the sketches are right and originally they were looking away. All I would say is in the sketches, the way the cherubs are actually sitting is not natural. I don't think they were originally carved that way, but you never know. I mean, it could have been all changed in that restoration.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
I don't know how relevant that would be necessarily. But, okay. Anybody else?
Sorry, I was speaking then, but I realised I wasn't.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Medicus. I'd like to hand over to Benny, please. Hello, Benny. I'm glad you could join us.
Yeah, so am I. I don't know what happened, but I managed to get in, you know. But I would like to thank you very much for a very wonderful description of all the details, a very competent guidance into all the facets of this fantastic monument. And especially I was fascinated by your decoding work, especially of the inscriptions. And there was one detail which I was especially interested in, and that was you mentioned the 5 T's in the end of the text. And I came to think of the Royal Arch. I don't know if you are aware that in the Royal Arch, the very central symbol of Royal Arch are these Tau letters. And I wonder if you could make a kind of link to this principle from what you said.
There's an even more interesting link, and that is the flag of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, of course, which has the 4 crosses, on the present day Georgian flag. So yes, I mean, I don't know if there is any particular connection, but yeah, the 3 towers in Arch, but here are 4. But I've always thought of the one in Arch as being somehow incomplete, because actually it should be finished at the bottom.
Yeah,
and you'd end up with something very similar to the flag of the Crusader Kingdom, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
It has occurred to me as well, but yeah. I don't know. It's short.
But actually, if you see the towers inscribed in a circle, you'll see that there's actually room for a 4th tower.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, and it could be something like that. But you know, it's part of the fun, really. I mean, that monument is just a bit of a game, isn't it? It's a bit of a puzzle, really. I mean, it's like the chat before, were the cherubs looking in or out? I mean, that in itself is like, I've never really given much thought to that, to be honest. So there's always something, isn't there, that makes you think so much in it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benny. I'd like to hand over to Jack.
Thanks so much, Michael. This was such a beautiful presentation. I particularly enjoyed your discussion of the utopian principles of wisdom, truth, and beauty as you found them in the monument. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those principles and about how the utopian society appears in Shakespeare and even in Rosicrucianism more generally for you.
Well, that's a huge area, isn't it? And what I was essentially just trying to do was to say that actually, I suppose what I'm saying is that it's very political, isn't it? It is about change. And if you think about utopian ideals, Rosicrucian ideals, they sort of run against the grain of how society, particularly at that time, worked. You know, you're talking about a day and age where Jesuit priests were hanged for being in England, or on the continent there was an inquisition, wars of religion, you know, yeah. So the discipline of society and the rule of law and suppression of individuals who stood out, who are different, burning of Copernicus or anything like that. So so I think there's an underground element here because it is political. Because if you're aspiring to a society of free speech and one where meritocracy has to take precedence, you've got to wait another couple of hundred years until Napoleon arrives on the scene for that sort of thing. You've got to keep a low profile. And so I think this is the reason why these ciphers and codes and things like that are developed. I think these blokes did meet. I think it's highly unlikely that they didn't have some form of early form of Freemasonry or perhaps the Rosicrucians infiltrated it. But the objective, the idea, would be to transform society in one way, shape, or form. You know, and Socrates and Plato were all about merit. They believed that there was a class system, like the golden ones, the philosopher caste were going to be in charge, but they were going to be in charge because they were wise, because they were kind and just. You know, they recognize that you're not going to have a sort of anarchic system. It's got to be, there does need to be government, but people will be educated, treated equally and with respect. And that shines forth in Shakespeare's work, because I mean, the whole human condition, the range of feelings, and even political stuff is contained in it. You know, the great themes of these plays. And by the way, I like the moustache you've grown. You've changed appearance quite a lot since we last met. Very good.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's new radical chops. I do have one more question for you, though. I know these are very big questions, but do you think that everything you're talking about is relevant to Rosicrucianism today and how we practice it?
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? I certainly think Shakespeare's work in terms of the human condition and feelings and that kind of thing, and the help we can draw from it is important. But is Rosicrucian relevant today? Because we have a society, well, it's not ideal. I suppose it needs finishing, doesn't it? It's like the rough ashlar at the moment. So yeah, there's democracy and free speech, and people are no longer hung, drawn and quartered for holding views which would have got them killed in the past. But it's still not perfect. It's not a true meritocracy anywhere in the world because it's still based on money, isn't it? It's still governed by a capitalist system. And the Rosicrucians weren't about that at all. I guess they'd believe in a ground zero, wouldn't they? Right, everyone's debt off, all national debt everywhere, and everyone's personal debt, and start again without a banking system. I'd vote for that. I'm sure others would, but I guess there's still work to be done. It's still relevant, and of course there's individual improvement as well. So it's not just societal. There's your own advancement as a person, being more empathetic to people, more creative, and spiritual, I suppose, as well. And it's being spiritual in a worldly context, a bit like Nestor, right? Pious, but still worldly wise at the same time. And I think that sums up Shakespeare. And I think that's why it definitely isn't more about him as much as it is about the sort of society that he wanted and his little group of friends plotting to try and make one happen.
Thank you.
All right. Good to see you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jack. Over to you, Alex, Rafaela, and those people gathered at the Atlantis bookstore in London, please.
Hi, guys. I don't have a question. It's more of an observation, and it's particularly in relation to Socrates' genius. There's a very, very common reference to Socrates, but it's a very specific reference that's often misallocated to the intellect. But in Greek, it's Socrates Demonas, and the Demones or Demonides were aspects or spiritual higher aspects potentially of the individual. And if you're looking at it as a three-stage process, the black, the white, and the red in alchemy, and him being the white or the manifestation of essentially the spirit or the attainment, that it could be a reference to the higher materializing and being channeled through essentially the intellect, rather than intelligence per se. That would perhaps link to the alchemical references and processes.
You see, he's already put it better than I have, but it's exactly, yeah.
Because the demones in the Greek religion are very, very specific spiritual sort of references to non-bodied entities or essentially higher forms, like the Platonic forms, higher wisdoms. And Socrates is always referred to as being governed by his demon, which is seen as a higher essential wisdom or a higher form of beauty or manifestation of wisdom that was being come through him. And and the reason as well, I think part of the reason he didn't write anything down, or his system is said to have not written anything down, was that Socrates' system is not necessarily a discourse, an intellectual discourse. He termed it a method of remembering. And what you were saying about the motto of Shakespeare, and also the ignorance of the people to their birthright, is that they've forgotten, they're ignorant, they don't remember, they're unaware.
Yeah.
Maybe that ties into essentially perhaps his mission and his and the remembrance of him as an individual.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Well said.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Is there anyone else at the Atlantis bookstore want to speak first? Hold your horses there, Alistair. I've got you up next. Anyone at the Atlantis bookstore? Anything else while we're there? Okay, Alistair, over to you.
Yeah, well done, Mike. Brilliant. And you do seem to be enjoying yourself, which is really lovely to see as well. Think you did I don't know very much about Shakespeare, to my shame. So I wonder if you could, just in case I missed it, but how much was Shakespeare involved in creating what is that wonderful monument that you give in your paper on? Did you actually mention that to us?
No, the book does touch upon it slightly. We don't know if he was involved in the making of the monument, but it was common to have been involved in it. It was also common to put them on the wall before you died, and then to add the inscriptions later.
Wow.
And another interesting fact is that the workshop that made it was on the South Bank close to the Globe Theatre.
So he could have been involved on an ongoing basis, you think?
Or it could have been his mates that made it.
Well, because the next thing that follows on from that was, you know, how much of that monument in the sacred architecture came from the Dutch monumental people doing the sacred proportions to get the monument looking right, and some of the things you're talking about. I mean, I'm just blown away with all your interpretation of the words, and I'll leave that awe to think about. But thank you very much. It was very good.
All I'd add there, actually, Alistair, is that when I've been to see the monument in Stratford, because, you know, it's one of those places you go to every 4 or 5 years, and perhaps slightly longer, but when you're in Stratford, you do tend to go along. I've always been dissatisfied with the information on it. There's very little in terms of guidance about it, and it's difficult to interpret. And there had to be more in it than just, because it, you know, if you just leave it at that, it's all a bit crap, actually, until you start to sort of like look deeper into it, you know, and then it's like, wow, this is really good. I'm moved by what Alex has just said, actually, on the Greek interpretation. I mean, yes, Shakespeare was English and he may not necessarily himself have looked into it like in quite the same way, but the people he mixed with would have done or could have done. And yeah, they influenced him. That goes back to what the lady said that opened up the questions, you know. And I just think that there's a lot of cross-cultural, cross-intellectual influences going on across all of these guys.
Well, his audience either read Greek, Latin, or him, really, didn't they?
Yeah.
Well done, well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Mario, over to you, please. Mario, are you there? You had your hand up. Okay, if he's not there, I'll come back to Mario in a short while and we'll hand over again to Benny.
Hello again. Yeah, I'm speaking to you from the land of Hamlet, actually. I was thinking of the influence that Shakespeare's plays has had on modern movies. I came to think of different directors like Kurosawa and Sergio Leone who modeled their stories after plays by Shakespeare. And I think in some way Shakespeare's spirit is still very much alive in modern dramas in some way or another. But I also had a comment on this political aspect of Rosicrucianism, where whether Rosicrucianism is relevant today or not. I think it's highly relevant. I mean, first of all, think of, I mean, we are lucky to live in countries where you have a freedom of speech and democracy and human rights, you know. But look at the world around us right now. The world is so dominated by totalitarian regimes everywhere. And also, I think Rosicrucianism is very relevant in that people have forgotten the spiritual side of life. They are very done on the material side, but the spiritual side they lack in a very high degree the connection with the spiritual world, and I think that's where Rosicrucianism is still very, very relevant.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say in answer to Jack's question. Actually, that's essentially it. Yeah, and from the land of Hamlet.
Right.
Thank you very much again, Benny. I wanted to mention something, please, Michael. I found it really curious. You described how there's an inscription on the tomb where I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me for the paraphrasing, but essentially it was laying a potential curse on anyone who would exhume the grave.
Yeah,
His bones. I am correct, yes?
Yeah.
Lovely, yeah. Okay. And it reminded me, I used to, when I was living in London, I lived in Highgate, and there's a very, very old cemetery, which maybe some of you have had the chance to visit, particularly the old cemetery. And there's a grave there. They only allow people now to enter that particular old section of Highgate Cemetery by guided tour. And I was really struck by one of the tour guide. He was very knowledgeable. He had one eye. He was quite a character, big old fellow.
Sure, it wasn't Odin.
No, he could have been an old Odin. He was a wizened character. And there's a grave there of a lady whose name was Elizabeth Siddal. I checked this. I'm reading this at the moment. She was the muse of a collection of the pre-Raphaelite artists. There's a very famous depiction of her in a painting by Sir John Everett Millais called Ophelia, where she's laying in a stream or in a pond on her back. She had very long red hair. You can see her in a number of pre-Raphaelite paintings. She's very, very striking woman figure. And the story goes that she she was in a relationship which was quite a turbulent relationship with Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who was a pre-Raphaelite artist, poet, and philanderer. She had a stillbirth. She also had an addiction to laudanum, and she died aged 32. And when she was buried, Dante Gabriele Rossetti buried his unpublished works wrapped up in her hair in the grave.
Wow.
Then a number of years later, I'm not quite sure how many years, I think it may have been not that many, maybe 7 or so years, he decided to, he regretted the fact that he'd hidden his unpublished works or buried his unpublished works, so exhumed the grave. The tour guide told the story this way. He said that when the grave was exhumed, the body of the woman with the long red hair had wrapped her hair so tightly around the book that they had to cut the hair to get the book out. And then he later published those works. She was then reinterred and so on. I just speculate that maybe there were those people who may have suspected potentially that Shakespeare would have buried with him certain things of value, hence the curse that he would potentially place upon anyone who would exhume his grave and attempt to move his bones elsewhere. It's just a curious observation as to why that was a very strong thing to lay a curse on anyone who would move the bones. Yeah, I'd welcome any thoughts on that.
Wow, that's a beautiful story. The legend about the removal of his bones was that a crew in the 1780s broke in and they dug down, and he was only buried, and this is true, he was only buried 3 feet deep. And they didn't have to dig very far. There's no metal about him either, so he was buried without any form of metal. So there's not a coffin. It was probably a woolen sackcloth, which was an act of piety. Because another thing about yes, act of piety essentially, because I mean his grave's very simple. It's not ostentatious at all. It was important to him not to be disturbed. I often wonder though if it's got something to do with the fate of his son. Actually, a lot of this concern, because Hamnet died at the age of 11. In 1596. No one knows how or why he died, but he did, and has no known grave. So it could be that Hamnet was actually, his body was disposed of in a plague pit or something like that, or maybe in a grave that's now disappeared in the churchyard. And Shakespeare wanted to avoid that fate, I think. As to whether anything's buried with him, I don't know. We won't know that until there's a survey, a proper one. They exhume him, if they're ever going to do that. The church has refused to do that, you see. Yes, and I think the memorial on the wall refers to him being contained within, but he's not, you see, he's actually buried nearby. He's not in it. So is that a clue to something perhaps in the monument itself, rather than the grave that might be contained within it? And certainly masters of that nature often did have some work buried with them, didn't they? You know, and if there is an allusion to the grave of Christian Rosenkreutz, which isn't that crazy, given that this monument dates from 1616 onwards, it was very popular with those manifestos coming out, could have been an allusion to it. Maybe there's a little clue that something was put in, because of course Rosenkreutz was buried with bits and pieces, wasn't he, in a very similar way.
I was also curious about...
Either really or mythologically, or whatever you want to look at it.
Oh, sorry, there was a delay there. Sorry about that, Michael.
Yes. No, so, I mean, yes, there could be something buried with him, or perhaps in that entablature on the wall, I don't know, but probably not.
Thank you. I was also curious, you mentioned about the angle of that particular part of...
Yes, I know.
That's very curious.
Odd, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's odd that it would be slightly toward the sunrise in the east, beyond. So if you think the north being the darkest point, and it's not at the north, and it's not at the northeast, it was slightly further into where, if you like, before the sun's risen, there's that, we perceive the halo of the dawn that's about to rise.
Yeah.
And I think that that's very interesting. It's all speculation, obviously, but in relation to, you said that his works were designed in some respect to I'm not quite sure how you said it. It was really, really well put, to that there was a commentary on the state of the human condition and the necessity for change, or that there was something about it which implied something new on the horizon.
Yeah.
And I think that as Benny was saying, the rise, particularly lately, in interest in the Rosicrucian studies, is it like, if you like, a Rosicrucian Renaissance? For me, it symbolizes a similar thing, that there's a feeling which people are beginning to perceive, they're beginning to pick up on, that there is a vast amount of light just about to rise above the horizon. And at the moment, we're still kind of struggling with the fact that, because there's a saying I really like, which is, the greater the light, the more defined the shadows. And there are many, many very well-defined shadows in the world currently. And
Yeah.
I think what's important in relation to this is the fact that we're moving towards something which is has a potential to illuminate and to elevate human consciousness.
Yeah, I agree.
Welcome your thoughts on this.
Well, what I think is this. I think that while a lot of the Rosicrucian ideals have been achieved, like free speech and education and equality and all those sorts of things, what we haven't got is the governance that they wanted. We don't have that. Our governance is based on usury and other things of that nature, and so it's out of sync. It's not balanced. It's awry. You know, and I think that yes, so I want to go back to Jack again. I mean, if there's a purpose for Rosicrucian, it's to try and to do something about that aspect of it on the governance side. You know, I'll tell you what though, the one person that knows most about Rosicrucian anyone knows is Alistair, and I'd like to know whether he thinks whether Shakespeare was a Rosicrucian. I'd be quite keen to know that, Alistair, if you want to come back on.
Well, thank you. My opinion is that Rosicrucian is as important now because of your mentions of utopia and the question that was raised from you, that we haven't got there yet. You know, we'd all love to get to a utopian world, and I think the way of getting there is the way that Rosicrucians, or people who are trying to rationalize how things should be in the future, and using the past as an experience, but also understanding that we've got to change the way we do things today to make it relevant today. So we can't just hark back on Rosicrucianism. It's got to be the new kind of Rosicrucianism. And of course, the young people of today, the young children, the 10, 12, 14-year-olds, they're really making an effort to make something of the new age, which is very encouraging. I don't think I can keep up with them with many other things, but on that side, they seem to be doing well. As far as Shakespeare being a Rosicrucian, it's difficult. I don't know all his works, but I know that some of his works are historical, some of them were philosophical, some of them were romantic. You know, he was desperately trying to convey and entertain, in a thought-provoking way that most of his audience, the sort of the unwashed, me in the stalls, we didn't understand too much, but we kind of got some of what was there because it was acted and there was music and movement. And so the whole gambit of senses were being attacked in these plays. It wasn't just the words. I think, and that comes down to a lot of what Rosicrucians are trying to do, is trying to get the messages over in lots of different ways. Just an opinion, really.
Yes, thank you. It's really good.
Thank you, Alistair. I'd like to ask, does anyone else have anything they'd like to ask of Michael relevant to his presentation? Any observations? Anybody else, please feel free, speak up. I have something in the chat here from Medicus that's interesting. He said, on the topic of the tombs, there does seem to be an additional space for one more body, yet is left empty, question mark. For such precise architecture, this appears odd placement.
Well, there's nothing, I mean, there's no inscription on that place. There might be somebody in there, but there's nothing on there. But yeah, dear old Medicus, he's got an eye for detail, hasn't he? I'd say, I don't know the answer to that, because it's not one of Shakespeare's family that we know of. The others are marked graves, that isn't. It could be empty, don't know. Doubt it though.
Sheen, before we go, I see that our Italian friend is back on the screen, but has he got his question ready, or
I don't know, let's ask. Mario, you had your hand up a little while ago and then you disappeared. So if you do have a question or a comment, please feel free.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, hello, Mario.
Okay, that's good, because probably it's a problem with headphones. So two simple things that I noticed. First of all, I already just written to Michael. Congratulations, it's
thanks, Mario.
Well done. It's a great job. One thing that I'm considering, but I wanted to review because I mean it's premature because I have to reread it. Is the Latin epitaph. You showed that you can read it from up down, but also, I mean, in upright position. Yeah. But if you read it from, I mean, normally as two lines, it changes also the meaning. This is what I grasped, and because at the very beginning I started reading from left to right as if they were, I mean, a normal inscription, But then you notice that it's like this upright position that you can read in three different, and it changes a lot, the meaning. This is something that I wanted to check, but it seems that it was also something of the time. It was deep in vogue in those days, having this sort of cryptic way of playing games, especially with a language like Latin that absolutely is perfect for this kind of game of words. For instance, English or Italian can't do this, because they have articles, they have prepositions, and it's the morphology of the language. So this is a fact. I have an epitaph in my mind here in Rome that I normally start thinking about, which is absolutely perfect for this, as an example. Second thing regarding the curse, it seems to me something revealing a concept pre-Christian. You have plenty of inscriptions in ancient cenotaph or tombs, pre-Christians, when you have a curse. This is the but also in Greek tombs and Roman tombs, pre-Christian. You see very clearly something like that. It seems to me something translated into English, but typical in English, the perfect word is curse. So it's precisely what he wanted to mention, but it seems to me, again, something pre-Christian. This is my knowledge regarding this. I've read many other epitaph non-Christians. This is very interesting. And another thing, I simply wanted to say that these three pillars of words, you notice, is a square 3, basically, is 9. So this is the concept that comes out from that. And okay, you can go ahead as you mentioned perfectly with sacred geometry, Kabbalah, blah 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 blah. I mean, it's absolutely any sort. I have to say, and this is and then I concluded, the Sephirotic tree is perfect. If you have, this is the something, not because it's the last one, but it's perfect. It fits perfectly. Sorry, thank you very much indeed. Congratulations.
Yeah, there's some really good points there. The first one is really interesting, Mario. Actually, good to see you again, by the way. How are you keeping? The second, the key mute on. The thing about the Latin, scholars don't know why there's a mixture of Latin and English, and they've said, well, it just, why would you do that? It's obviously all in Latin and all in English. You've explained why, because the Latin gives you the ability to actually form columns, sentences, as well as form sentences and columns. That's why the Latin is being used, and that answers that question. And it emphasizes and reinforces why this is such a clever monument. Yes, thank you. The second point, I think, was about the inscription. Well, remember this, when Shakespeare, yeah, at the time of Shakespeare, England was going through the Reformation. Now, the chantry, which was built there for purgatorial prayers, okay, had been abolished in 1547 from memory. That was the Abolition of Chantries Act, 1547. So the chantry was no longer there, 1547-48, in that period. Shakespeare's family were Catholic. There's debate about it, but almost certainly they were Catholic. I'm convinced of it. So he knows that the charnel house, which actually isn't a place just for dumping bones, they were treated with respect. They were reinterred and placed in the charnel house, where they were to be left in perpetuity. But charnel houses and chantries were getting torn down all over the country at that period during the Reformation. Church windows were being broken and smashed. Statues were being destroyed. The Latin Mass had been made illegal. There were so many things going on. He suspected probably that if he was dug up, put anywhere, it certainly wouldn't have been in the charnel house, and there definitely would never have been prayers said for his repose, because that was now illegal during that time, a time of change and repression. Okay, so I mean, the Reformation is both a good and bad thing, yeah. But on the bad side of it was the loss of that deep spirituality that people had in the Middle Ages, which was coming to an end, in England at least. So I think he was concerned about that. I would not say that it's any influence from a pre-Christian sort of school of thought or anything like that. It's Christian. He wants his body intact for the resurrection, but he'd have happily gone into the charnel house, probably, or somewhere like that, you know, had it been left with a chantry and without any danger of demolition. But it was. And in fact, during his lifetime, the top part of it was used as the vicar's study. So the chantry came out, the vicar went in to use it as a study. Shakespeare saw all of this going on and didn't like it. And that was the reason for that. In my opinion, anyway.
Can I ask you, you say that he wouldn't have been happy with that. You say that the priest would have gone in there for study. What do you mean?
Well, originally that chantry was designed, it was on 3 floors. Okay. There was the basement, the middle floor, and there was a top part. So the basement was where the bones were stored. Okay. The middle part may have been used as the chantry, but more likely that was upstairs, and perhaps the middle part was used as a vestry where they would practice choir and put robes on and things like that. And upstairs it may have been used as the chantry, one or the other. So the point I'm making is that Shakespeare would not, I don't think, have been happy with the secular use of that structure. Okay, the vicar going in and just basically just using it as his study, which is what I understand it to be. So the church lost its chantry. It was no longer permitted to have choristers there. They used to have a room set aside in that charnel house for it. So we've got to get around this idea that charnel house, dusty old room of bones, is more than that to the people and to Catholics. It's a place where you're close to the dead. It's a place where they're a part of your life and the monks do. And that was important to Shakespeare.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for your patience, Kristen. You've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead, please. Oh, you're muted, Kristen. You need to unmute yourself. That's it.
Sorry. Okay, just something brief, and I want to get this clear. So Shakespeare himself, you're saying, was not actually buried in the crypt meant for him? Is that?
No, he's buried in the chancel, so it's an ordinary grave.
Right.
So he's buried in soil, in a sackcloth, very unostentatious, in the chancel. The memorial is separate. That's a few feet away.
Right. That's what I thought you meant.
Yeah.
So would there be a chance that someone would have disturbed?
They did, and they have. Yeah. Yeah.
In like how many times would it be known?
Well, we've got a record of one disturbance. That wasn't believed by many people until the archaeologists did their survey, and now they know that the stone is broken where his grave is, and no one knew why. It's likely the robbers, they basically just destroyed that stone. They chopped it up to dig down, and they didn't dig deep. They found a skull, which they described as that of a dainty small skull, and they didn't think it was like a man's skull, but it was in Shakespeare's grave. They took it away. They tried to flog it off. I think they tried to flog it to Dr. Johnson, of all people, who told them to put it back. They couldn't find a buyer for it, probably because of the curse or the high esteem that people held Shakespeare. And they were unable to put it back, and they put this skull in Beeley Parish Church, which isn't that far away. And it's still there. And the archaeologists did a test on it, and they discovered that it was the skull of a woman who was in her 70s, exactly the same age as Anne Hathaway.
Right, right.
Now,
but do you think that beyond that time it may have also been disturbed?
Yeah, I don't know. We know of that one. That one. I think it's been left alone for the most part because of the curse. I mean, why would anyone tempt such a thing? You know, it just doesn't make any sense, really. Yeah. And it worked in the sense that they couldn't sell the skull anyway.
Right. It kind of adds to the theory that maybe he lived on.
What's ironic about it, though, right, is Yorick, is the fact that the grave diggers digging up Hamlet's friend, and Hamlet holds the skull of Yorick, doesn't he? And has this, it remembers him, and he's holding this skull, you know. He says we're all going to end up dead, you know, but there's probably a life after this anyway. But because Yorick lives on, you know, that kind of thing. He recalls him, he's holding the skull, and of course his own skull. So, you know, maybe that thing with in Hamlet, that very powerful scene about death and mortality, maybe that plays a little part in the role of the curse as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Lovely room, by the way. Looks really interesting.
Oh, thank you. I've been to Egypt twice.
Yeah, that's good. It's better than this room. So.
Once again, Kristen, does anybody else have anything they'd like to say or ask Michael? Anybody at all? Okay, so Michael, would you like to sum up? Is there anything you'd like to say? Please go ahead.
Oh, no, not really. I think we've covered everything. I liked what Alex had to say. I think that greater in-depth knowledge about Socrates and the Greek processes, that's what these talks are about, aren't they? They're about putting something out there and developing it on, and that's an area to explore in more detail, actually. I think the central role of Socrates and the influence on self-improvement. Yeah,
ongoing research and development. Then
there is not for me, alas. I'm moving on to other aspects, but other areas. But
okay.
that would be a good one to look into for somebody, for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you very much once again, Michael, for a wonderful presentation. And yeah, it's lovely to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see everyone, all here, there, and everywhere around the world joining us. It's really wonderful to see you. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be here. I would like to just take a brief moment to mention to everybody that for those of you who were able to join the December 2022 Metropolitan Study Group meeting, I was speaking to people about the upcoming entrance of Pluto into the sign of Aquarius, which is just on the horizon. It will be entering Aquarius, starting a kind of back and forth process around or about just after midday on the 23rd. However, I was encouraging people to join together in meditation and to make the most positive use of the great and mighty celestial tides and energies that this astrological event is going to usher in. It'll be in, Pluto will be in Aquarius until 2044. And it's likely to usher in a period of shake-up and radical transformation right across the board. The last time it was in Aquarius, we saw the American Revolution, the French Revolution. The time before that, Copernicus published his heliocentric theory, which was radical and heretical at the time. It created a huge perceptual shift in our understanding of our place in the wider creation. And so we're about to see this process begin on a higher octave, starting on the 23rd. And for those who wish to join together in meditation at this time to acknowledge this event, the purpose for doing such, for observing such a meditation would be to align ourselves with and to invoke and surrender ourselves in service to the highest positive transformational potential that we can make use of. There are going to be great changes taking place right across the globe and throughout society. And as individuals, we have the opportunity, we either kind of just bumble along and everybody is kind of just carried along by events in the world, or we are forewarned and forearmed, and then we can do the very best we can to, as I say, align ourselves with the highest good. And then we have a responsibility toward ourselves to do our best to become a better version of ourselves throughout the coming years. So I just wanted to remind everybody about this and to encourage people, if they wish to link up as per the meditation that's suggested in the December meeting, then to do so at midnight on the 23rd of March. There will be people who are involved in a variety of different orders. Thank you, Mario. Wonderful, thank you. There are people I'm aware of involved in a number of different orders who will be joining in this meditation for this purpose. And I think this is an example of maybe in a subtle way, but in a powerful and potent way, we can join together and collectively, hopefully, amplify the good in the world. Thank you, Benny. Amplify the good in the world through aligning ourselves with these very mighty and portentous celestial energies. And this is something really I feel that we have a great opportunity here. We're in very special company, the people that gather for these meetings, people of like mind and temperament, who are all in our own ways committed to inner development and spiritual service, being of service in the world. So we have a great opportunity to gather together, and there's great strength in our number. So I just wanted to remind everybody of this. So it would be midnight on the 23rd. And I look forward, John, wonderful. Thank you, John. I look forward to gathering together with all of those people who choose to participate in this. And let's do our very best to raise our own individual vibration and to collectively radiate an influence into the world at large, invoking and inviting a blessing from the heavenly realms to assist humanity at this time, to raise ourselves up.
Thank you. It's an auspicious date, 32323.
Oh, wonderful. I hadn't realized that, Kristen. Thank you very much. That's beautiful. There you go. Thank you for that observation.
By the way, 23 is the number of good luck in Rome. I'm in Rome, so it's a symbol of good luck, 23. I don't know why, but probably because it's 8. I don't know, but this is the idea. 23 is a typical number of good luck. So it could be
good luck.
Yes, of good luck. It's a good number, considered a good omen, positive, a fortune. This is it.
What nationality is it good luck?
Well, you have it in Rome. Normally people think that in the number 23 is good. So when you mention 23 is nice. Simply want to know, is midnight GMT, I suppose?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sheen,
send a memo, please, to remind this. Okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye.
Alex?
Bye.
Sheen, are you actually leading one, or are you just asking everyone to sort of join in individually and sort of think upon that current?
I'm asking anybody who wishes to participate to gather in their sacred spaces, and if they wish to follow a formula, I'd recommend that they were to visualize ourselves and a group of people gathering in a vast circle. Form a link with the hands, visualize the circle, and in our own personal way, as I mentioned, to invoke and invite a blessing from the heavenly realms to assist humanity to raise ourselves up to a higher and more positive vibrational state, for want of a way of describing this in words.
Good.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I could maybe ask, I'll ask the relevant person in the province of London to send an email out, just reminding people of this.
Yes, we can send one to the study group email list.
Yeah, that would be great. Let's make good use of the opportunity. So once again, thank you very much, Michael, for your presentation today. And have a wonderful rest of the weekend, everyone. Lots of love to you, and see you all soon.